The closer they got to Valoran, the more populated the road became. What had started as scattered travelers turned into long lines of movement feeding toward the gates from every direction. Carts creaked through the snow under heavy loads of grain, lumber, cloth, and firewood. Pilgrims in layered cloaks walked shoulder to shoulder with merchants and refugees, all of them funneled toward the city beneath the red glow of the blood moon hanging overhead. The group slowed near the edge of the road where a cluster of supply wagons had stopped to retie their harnesses and barter for passage priority. No one paid them much attention, as the city had drawn too many people for anyone to study every face too closely. Even still, Cassian kept his hood low. As they approached, more justiciars appeared. Some worked the road itself, inspecting carts and questioning travelers before they even reached the gates. Others stood elevated along the walls with crossbows and lanterns, watching the lines below instead of the horizon beyond them. "It's worse than I thought," Juno muttered, watching a pair of zealots force an old man away from the main queue after checking the symbol stitched into his coat. "Glavius is locking the city down," Severic said. "Nobody will get near the cathedral without his permission tonight." Leaf had already drifted several steps away from the group, disappearing into the movement around them. He pulled his hood lower and adjusted the torn edge of his cloak until it sat unevenly across one shoulder, changing the shape of his silhouette. Within seconds, he was weaving through the merchants, laborers, and passing carts like he belonged there, listening more than looking. Jackson watched him go. "I hate when he does that." "He is good at it," Juno replied. Dorian kept his attention on the walls. "The main gate is going to be impossible," he said. "Too many checkpoints and eyes." Cassian nodded. He had already reached the same conclusion. The walls stretched wide around the city, but unlike the outer roads, the far sections weren't nearly as active. Patrols still moved, but thinner, with less traffic and fewer witnesses. "We aren't going through the front," he said. "We will find a quiet section of the wall and go over." Gabriel looked up toward the cathedral again. Even from here, it dominated the skyline, the dark cloud above it slowly turning beneath the blood moon like smoke trapped underwater. Bells rang somewhere inside the city walls, echoing eerily off the stone. "Whatever they're doing," Gabriel said, "it's already started." A cart rolled past close enough for Cassian to catch the smell of incense and burned oil from beneath its tarp. Red cloth had been nailed along the sides beside painted symbols of the Crimson Sun. Two zealots walked alongside it with clubs hanging from their belts, staring into the crowd instead of ahead. Juno watched them pass. "This is why I hate religion," she said quietly. "Dion agrees," Dion answered. "Everyone looks scared," Dorian said. Nobody in the streets looked hopeful. Nobody looked faithful. They looked tense, like an entire city had been told something terrible was coming and had decided obedience was safer than asking questions. Leaf finally returned through the crowd, appearing beside them suddenly enough that Jackson flinched. "There's a break in patrol along the western wall," Leaf said. "Not too far down." Cassian looked at him. "Are you sure?" "I watched 2 patrol rotations stop before getting there," Leaf replied. "Both turned and came back. They aren't expecting anything to come over the wall." Cassian looked west along the wall toward the darker stretch where the city lights thinned and the stone disappeared into the jagged terrain near the cliffside. "Then that's where we need to go." The main flow of traffic still pushed toward the gates ahead, but here the crowd bottlenecked between supply carts, livestock, and temporary vendor stalls set up against the outer road. Lanterns swung overhead in the wind while merchants shouted over each other, trying to sell food, blankets, charms, or passage into the city before the checkpoints closed again. Cassian kept the group moving, angling them along the edge of the crowds instead of through the center of it. The less attention they drew, the better. Leaf drifted ahead again. Not far, but just enough to keep eyes off the rest of them while he threaded through the gaps between the travelers and carts, his hood down low and his posture loose enough to disappear into the movement around him. Then somebody grabbed his sleeve. "Hey!" The voice cut through the noise sharper than it should have. Leaf twisted immediately, trying to pull free, but the older merchant holding the fabric stumbled with him and nearly went down beneath the wheels of a passing cart. "You little shit!" the man shouted. "Watch where you're going!" Heads turned. Leaf jerked his sleeve free and tried to move with the crowd again, but it was already too late. 2 justiciars near the checkpoint had heard the shouting and were looking directly at him now. "You there!" one of them barked. Leaf kept walking. The second guard moved faster. He shoved through the crowd and caught Leaf by the shoulder hard enough to stop him in place. "I said stop!" Cassian cursed under his breath. Leaf's eyes flicked once towards the group, measuring the distance. He could probably break free from one guard, but not from 6. More justiciars were already turning toward the commotion. "What's your business in Valoran?" the guard demanded. Leaf didn't answer. The justiciar's grip tightened immediately. "Take your hood off." Saberic stepped forward before anyone else could take action. "Enough," he said sharply as he stepped through the crowd toward them. "He's with me." The guard turned gruffly. "And who are you? You can remove your hood too. Show your faces." That was the wrong response. Cassian saw Saberic's expression change instantly, recognition of where this was going. The justiciars had already started spreading around them now, separating the crowd away from the confrontation. "Papers," another demanded. "Now!" "We don't have time for this," Saberic said. "What you don't have," the first guard answered, "is a choice." He reached for Leaf again. Saberic caught the man's wrist before he could. Everything after that happened too fast. The justiciar reacted immediately, shoving Saberic backward and reaching for the sword at his belt. Saberic struck first, clean enough to snap the guard's head sideways and send him crashing into the side of a cart. The street exploded. "Arrest them!" the stunned guard shouted. More red cloaks rushed toward them from the checkpoint as civilians scattered in every direction. One of the guards slammed into Saberic from the side while another drove the butt of a spear into Leaf's stomach before he could slip free, folding him forward into the snow. Cassian's hand moved toward his weapon. Dorian caught his arm immediately. "Stop." Cassian looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "They'll kill him," Cassian hissed. "And all hope is lost if we all get caught," Dorian shot back. Another wave of justiciars crashed into the fight before either could move. Saberic drove one of them backward with a shoulder check, but there were too many now, piling onto him from every direction. Leaf tried to disappear back into the crowd once more and made it 3 steps before a baton cracked across the back of his knee and dropped him hard. Juno stepped forward instinctively. Dorian blocked her too. "We cannot fight the whole city," he said calmly. "Think about what we're doing here." She gritted her teeth, but knew he was right. The guards forced Saberic to his knees first, blood running from the corner of his mouth as they wrenched his arms behind his back. Leaf took a strike across the side of the head that left him dazed long enough for iron restraints to snap around his wrists. "Heretics!" one of the zealots shouted from somewhere in the crowd. The noise spread instantly after that. People backed away from the scene while others surged closer to watch. More justiciars poured in from the gate road, weapons drawn, scanning the crowd for anyone else connected to them. Cassian forced himself to step back into the movement instead of forward. Every instinct in him screamed otherwise. Saberic looked up once through the crowd and locked eyes with him. No fear, no panic, just the slow shake of his head as a warning. Then the guards dragged both of them toward the city gates while the crowd swallowed the rest of the group whole. Within minutes, the road had already begun closing around the arrest, merchants pulling carts back into place while the travelers lowered their heads and kept moving toward the gates like nothing happened. The justiciars had dragged Saberic and Leaf through the checkpoint line toward the city interior, disappearing into the red mass of cloaks and torchlight. Cassian still watched the spot where they'd vanished. "If we go after them now, we lose everyone," Dorian said quietly. Cassian didn't answer. His jaw tightened before he finally looked away from the gate. Every part of him hated it, but Dorian was right. Charging the checkpoint would end with all of them chained or dead before they ever got near the cathedral. Gabriel glanced toward the center of the city where the black cloud still turned beneath the blood moon. The ritual is more important. Saberic and Leaf both know that. Juno looked back toward the gate one last time. "And if they execute them before we can get to them?" "They won't," Dorian answered. "Not immediately, at least. The church arrests first, interrogates second. Public punishment comes after." Cassian frowned and gathered himself. They peeled away from the road carefully, using the lingering confusion around the checkpoint to disappear into the movement of wagons and foot traffic before circling west along the outer edge of the city. The noise of the crowd faded with it, replaced by wind scraping against stone and the distant ringing of cathedral bells still deeper inside. The western wall rose above them in uneven sections where the terrain became rougher and harder to navigate. Jagged rock formations pushed up against the city foundation there, forcing the wall to curve awkwardly along the cliffside. The stone itself was older too, darker, weathered by years of snow and runoff. Leaf had been right. Cassian studied the patrol route once, watching 2 justiciars pass overhead along the battlements before disappearing farther down the wall. "This is it," he said. He stepped toward the wall and pressed one hand against the stone. Then he started climbing, His boots found impossible purchase against the vertical surface as he moved upward, body low against the wall while his hands and feet carried him steadily higher. Snow and loose grit fell beneath him as he climbed past cracks and weathered stonework, disappearing briefly into shadow whenever torchlight swept across the battlements overhead. Jackson watched him for a second. Every time he does that, I hate it a little more. Dorian kept his eyes on the patrol route. You should thank him for being useful. Cassian reached the top just as another pair of guards disappeared around the far bend of the wall walk. He pulled himself over silently, vanished from sight for several tense seconds, then a rope dropped back down the stone face. Dorian grabbed it and tested the tension. It's solid. One by one, they climbed the wall. Dorian went after Dion, then Juno despite the pain still riding through her arm. Gabriel followed quietly, his eyes never staying far from the cathedral looming over the city skyline, even from this distance. Jackson came last. Cassian waited above, crouched low behind the battlements while the patrol lanterns moved somewhere farther down the wall. The city sprawled out beneath their feet. Red banners hanging from buildings and watchposts silhouetted in torchlight and smoke. The sound of marching boots carrying through the streets below. Cassian gave a short motion toward the inner side of the wall and they descended into Valoran without being seen. The city felt worse on the inside of the walls. The deeper they moved, the more the atmosphere changed from tension into something closer to fever. Streets that should have been crowded with evening trade and tavern noise were instead filled with processions of the red-robed zealots carrying lanterns and burning censers through the intersections. Bells rang constantly now from somewhere nearer the cathedral district, overlapping each other in uneven patterns that never stopped. The sky overhead had turned violent. The blood moon hung directly above the city, swollen in dark crimson, its light bleeding across the rooftops and stone in uneven shades that made everything look bruised. The cloud mass over the cathedral had thickened into a spiraling vortex that rotated slowly beneath it, pulling smoke and ash upward from the city below. Nobody walking the streets looked comfortable. People moved quickly, heads down, avoiding the justiciars stationed nearly at every corner. Windows had been shuttered, doors barred. Even the few vendors still operating did so quietly, speaking in hushed voices like they were afraid of being overheard. Cassian led the group through the narrower side streets instead of the main roads, keeping them away from patrols where possible. The cathedral still towered over the city ahead of them, impossible to lose sight of no matter where they turned. Dion finally broke the silence first. We're really leaving our friends? He asked. Cassian glanced toward the eastern district where the larger guard towers sat above the rooftops. The holding cells will be near the central barracks, he said quietly. That's where they'd be taken. Gabriel looked toward the cathedral instead, and Vera is up there. Dorian's jaw tightened. We hope. Cassian slowed near the mouth of another alley, stopping long enough to study the movement ahead before speaking. If we split up, we lose time, he said. If we hit the barracks first, we risk missing the ritual completely. Jackson folded his arms against the cold, eyes still fixed upward toward the swirling sky over the cathedral. And if that ritual finishes, he said, none of the rest matters anyway. Dorian stepped closer to the alley wall as another patrol crossed the street ahead. 4 justiciars, 2 zealots. He waited until they passed before speaking again. We have to stop the ritual first, he said. Then we worry about getting them out. We have to pray they can hold on until then. Dion huffed, but even he knew there was no other way. Cassian looked back toward the cathedral again. We gotta move, he said hurriedly. The streets widened near the central avenues as they got closer to the cathedral, but the space only made the scenes playing out around them harder to ignore. Red-robed zealots moved from building to building in groups, pounding on doors with the butts of their staffs while justiciars stood behind them with weapons drawn. A woman screamed somewhere ahead. The group slowed near the mouth of a side street just in time to see 2 cultists dragging a man barefoot through the snow while his family shouted from the doorway behind him. One of the justiciars turned and struck the older woman across the face hard enough to throw her against the frame of the house. Blasphemer! One of the zealots shouted as they hauled the man away. How dare you defy God? Nobody in the street intervened. People looked away instead. Cassian kept moving before Dion could stop and stare too long. Windows were being boarded shut all across the district. Families shoved furniture against the doors from inside while others crouched behind curtains, watching the streets through the narrow cracks with the same expression Cassian had seen in towns under siege long ago. Jackson glanced toward another building where crimson paint had been splashed across the stone in uneven lettering. Repent before it's too late. Directly beside it stood a bronze statue nearly 3 stories tall. Bishop Glavius. One hand raised toward the sky, the other clutching the symbol of the crimson sun against his chest. Torches burned around the base while kneeling civilians prayed beneath it under the watch of armed men wearing the same red robes. Every plaza held another monument, another banner, another proclamation nailed into stone or wood. Some showed painted images of horned demons being cast into fire beneath the symbol of the church. Others warned of corruption, impurity, or the punishment awaiting those who resisted the coming purification. The propaganda wasn't trying to inspire people, it was trying to terrify them. Gabriel slowed near a staircase overlooking one of the lower streets. A line of civilians had been forced to kneel there while a zealot shouted scripture at them from above. Behind them, a pair of justiciars dragged another body down the steps by the arms, leaving a streak of blood through the snow. "The city is broken," Gabriel said quietly. "This is not the Valoran I remember," Cassian answered. His eyes stayed fixed ahead on the cathedral rising above the rooftops. The streets began emptying as they neared the center of the city. The chanting faded behind them, replaced instead by the low tolling of the bells inside and the distant sound of wind moving through the massive cathedral structure. The grand cathedral stood above them like a fortress. Massive stairways climbed toward enormous bronze doors beneath towering arches lined with statues of saints and martyrs worn smooth by time. Red banners hung from every column, stirring slowly beneath the unnatural wind spiraling overhead. The black cloud above the cathedral rotated directly over the spire, thick enough to blot out the stars and moon entirely above the structure. Cassian slowed at the bottom of the stairs. "There should be guards everywhere, right?" Juno said quietly. She was right. There weren't any. No patrols on the stairs, no justiciars at the entrance. They quickly climbed the flights of stairs to the entrance, and the bronze doors groaned inward beneath Cassian's hands as he pushed. Warm air rolled out from the cathedral as the group slipped inside, heavy with incense and candle smoke. The doors closed behind them a moment later with a deep echo that carried through the structure and vanished somewhere deep within. The sanctum of the grand cathedral was immense. Rows of towering stone columns stretched upward into darkness, supporting vaulted ceilings painted with fading murals of saints, fire, and the crimson sun. Thousands of candles burned throughout the sanctuary in layered clusters, their light reflecting off polished marble floors and casting long shadows across statues that lined the central aisle. Saint Havel stood among them near the center of the chamber, carved from pale stone with one raised hand toward the heavens while the other rested against the sword planted before him. The stained glass above was brilliant beneath the blood moon. Crimson light spilled through the windows and painted the cathedral interior in red and gold, shifting across the floor and walls like something alive moving through the structure. But the cathedral was empty. Dorian looked around slowly. "Shouldn't this place be packed?" "It usually is," Cassian answered. He stepped past the rows of pews without slowing, his eyes already moving ahead toward the eastern side of the sanctuary. The others followed him close behind, their footsteps echoing softly across the marble. Juno glanced toward one of the massive murals overhead. "Hard to believe this place is for those tyrants outside." "That's because this place came first," Gabriel said, "when the crimson sun was for the people." Cassian turned down a narrower side passage beyond the altar. Unlike the sanctuary, the corridors here were tighter, older, built from rougher stone beneath the polished cathedral above. Candlelight thinned the farther they moved inward, replaced by hanging lanterns and long shadows stretching through the halls. "This way," Cassian said quietly, remembering his time inside the walls. Dorian watched him for a moment. "You know exactly where you're going." "I spent years here," Cassian answered. "Justiciars aren't trained in the public halls." The corridor bent sharply downward. Then the sound reached them. Chanting. Not loud enough to make out words yet, but constant, layered beneath the stone like the cathedral itself was speaking. The farther they moved, the clearer it became. Jackson slowed slightly. "That's below us." Cassian nodded. "There's a chamber beneath the spire. They used it for anointings and sanctifications." They reached the end of the corridor a moment later where a circular staircase spiraled downward into darkness beneath the cathedral foundation. The chanting drifted upward through it now, stronger than before, joined by the faint sound of bells and something deeper underneath it, something mechanical turning far below the structure. Gabriel looked down into the dark. They've already started. Cassian placed a hand against the stone railing and began descending without another word. The staircase seemed to go on forever. The deeper they moved beneath the cathedral, the older the structure became. Polished marble disappeared first, replaced by rough stone darkened by moisture and age. The air grew warmer the farther down they went, thick with incense, smoke, and something metallic underneath it that Cassian recognized immediately, but didn't mention. Blood. The chanting grew louder with every turn of the stairs. Voices layered together in slow repetition that echoed through the stone in waves. The language shifted too the closer they got. What had sounded distant and indistinct above now carried sharper edges, harsher syllables that scraped through the corridors unnaturally. Jackson's expression tightened first. "That's infernal," he said quietly. Gabriel looked over at him. "You're sure?" Jackson smiled dryly, listening again as another wave of chanting rolled through the chamber below them. "You see these horns on my head? Yes, I'm sure." Cassian kept moving. The staircase finally leveled into a long underground corridor lined with ancient stone pillars and iron braziers burning with deep red flame instead of normal fire. The ceiling arched high overhead, disappearing into shadow between hanging chains and faded banners marked with the crimson sun. At the far end of the hall stood a set of enormous bronze doors. 2 justiciars guarded them. Unlike the patrols in the streets, these men wore ceremonial armor etched with scripture and sun markings worked directly into the steel. Their halberds rested upright in their hands while the red light from the braziers reflected across their helms. The chanting behind the doors had become unmistakable now. Dozens of voices, maybe more. Cassian stopped the group behind one of the pillars lining the corridor. "That's the chamber." Dion tightened his grip on his hammer. Dion ready to smash something. "Soon enough," Dion muttered. The guards hadn't seen them yet. One of them shifted slightly near the doors, adjusting his stance as the chanting rose again behind him. The second tilted his head like he'd heard something farther up the corridor. Gabriel raised a hand before either of them could react further. The air changed around him immediately. A low shimmer moved through the corridor like heat rolling across stone as he whispered the spell under his breath. The nearest justiciar blinked once, then again, his posture faltering as exhaustion hit him all at once. The second turned toward him just as his knees buckled beneath him. Both men collapsed hard against the floor. The halberds clattered across the stone, and the group took advantage of the moment. Cassian broke from cover first, sprinting down the corridor toward the doors while the others followed close behind. Juno and Dion reached the entrance beside him as the chanting thundered louder through the bronze beneath their hands, the infernal words scraping through the metal like something alive on the other side. Cassian grabbed the handle. "Ready?" he asked, looking back at the group. No one answered. He shoved the doors inward. The heat hit them first. Thick, suffocating air filled with incense smoke, blood, and the sharp sting of alchemy burning somewhere beneath it all. The chamber beyond was enormous, carved deep beneath the cathedral like an underground temple hidden beneath the holy structure above. The ritual was already underway. A machine dominated the center of the chamber, Azmakel's craftsmanship in full display, matching the blueprints they had studied. There was no mistaking it. A towering mass of black iron, bronze piping, rotating arcane rings and glass chambers had been built upward around a central platform like some grotesque cathedral of its own. Tubes carrying glowing crimson fluid pulsed through the structure in slow waves, while massive pistons turned beneath it with grinding mechanical force. Arcane and infernal symbols burned across the metal framework in violent red light, flaring brighter every time the machine shuddered. The sound filling the chamber wasn't only chanting, it was machinery. The deep groan of rotating gears, the hiss of steam, the wet pulse of fluid moving through tubes thick as a man's arm. Rows of red-robed cultists surrounded the structure in perfect formation, kneeling shoulder to shoulder across the lower chamber floor while dozens of justiciars stood behind them in ceremonial armor, heads bowed beneath the rhythm of the ritual. Every voice in the room moved together now, the infernal chant rolling through the chamber in slow, thunderous repetition. At the far end of the hall, raised high above the machine on a black stone platform, stood Bishop Glavius. Sweating beneath layers of ornate crimson robes stretched tight across his massive frame, gold symbols of the crimson sun hung across his chest while his bald head gleamed beneath the red light pouring through the chamber. His face twisted with fury and devotion at the same time, eyes wide as he led the chant with both hands raised over the congregation below. Every word that came from him echoed unnaturally around the room. The The blood moon's light spilled into the space through a massive circular opening carved high into the cathedral ceiling above the machine, the crimson glow pouring downward directly onto the center platform like a spotlight from the heavens themselves. And there, suspended above the machine, was Vera Morningstar. Her body hung several feet in the air, restrained by iron bindings wrapped around her wrists and torso, while thick tubes ran from her arms and sides into the machinery beneath her. Blood moved steadily through them in slow pulses, feeding the machine below while arcane symbols burned across the platform beneath her suspended form. Her head hung limp, but her chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths. The sight caused a shudder to pass over the party. Cassian moved before anything could stop him. The sight of Vera hanging above the machine hit him like a blade through the ribs, and whatever restraint had carried him this far shattered instantly. His breathing turned sharp and uneven as he stepped forward, eyes locked on the tubes pulling blood from her body in slow crimson waves. "Cassian, wait!" Juno shouted. It was too late. He lunged down the center aisle toward the nearest justiciar with a speed that didn't look human anymore. The guard barely had time to turn before Cassian hit him full force, slamming him backward into the stone floor hard enough to crack it beneath him. His teeth bared, eyes blackened, he tore into the man in a frenzy that looked closer to an animal attack than combat. The chamber erupted, but the chanting didn't stop, not even for a second. Justiciars snapped upright across the room, weapons clearing their sheaths while the rows of cultists continued their ritual without breaking formation, their voices riding louder now instead of faltering. "Protect the circle!" one of the priests screamed. Dion charged immediately after Cassian, hammer already swinging as he crashed into the nearest line of guards before they could fully regroup. Juno followed beside him with her shield and hammer raised while Gabriel and Jackson broke outward toward the edges of the chamber to stop the justiciars from surrounding them outright. Above it all, Glavius kept going. His voice boomed through the chamber louder now, almost drowning out the fighting itself as the machine pulsed beneath Vera's suspended body. Dorian ignored the guards completely. His eyes locked onto Vera as he pushed toward the edge of the machine platform, gauntlet already glowing blue. He thrust a hand forward and the spectral shape of his mage hand surged across the chamber toward the restraints binding her. As soon as it reached the machine, the spell collapsed. The arcane hand distorted violently the moment it crossed the threshold, unraveling into sparks that scattered harmlessly into the air before disappearing completely. Dorian stopped cold. "No, wait." The machine pulsed again. A wave of pressure rolled through the chamber hard enough that several candles along the outer walls blew out all at once. Gabriel felt it immediately, too. The energy he had been gathering in his palm flickered erratically before collapsing altogether. Jackson swore under his breath as the infernal magic building at his fingertips sputtered and vanished. The machine, Dorian realized. Another pulse hit the room. The arcane rings around the structure rotated faster while crimson light surged through the tubes feeding downward from Vera's body. "It's suppressing our magic," Gabriel said. Dorian's expression tightened as the realization landed fully. "Not just suppressing," he said. "Consuming." Another justiciar charged toward him and Juno intercepted the strike before it landed, shield smashing into the guard's chest hard enough to stagger him sideways. "No magic, just smash!" Dion roared from deeper in the chamber as he buried his hammer into another armored figure. Dorian stepped back from the machine, eyes moving rapidly across the structure as the truth settled into place. The vortex of magic surrounding the ritual was so dense the chamber itself had become unstable. Every spell reaching toward the machine simply broke apart and fed back into it instead. An anti-magic field. Steel rang against steel beneath the roar of the machine while the chanting continued without pause. The cultists kneeling around the platform, never breaking rhythm even as the fight spread through the chamber around them. The infernal words rolled louder now, carried by Glavius' voice above all others as he stood on the raised platform with both arms lifted toward the blood moon overhead. Cassian still tore through the justiciars like something unchained. There was nothing controlled left in him now. He moved too fast for the armored guards to properly react, striking one down before turning to the next without slowing, his teeth caving in throats, covering his own chin and chest with fresh crimson. One justiciar tried to block him with a shield, and Cassian slammed into him hard enough to drive them both across the stone floor before ripping the man downward and leaving him crumpled beneath the chanting. "Hold the line!" one of the captains shouted. Dion crashed into the front of them head-on, his hammer breaking apart formation after formation as he forced space open around Cassian, but every guard they dropped was replaced by another stepping into the gap. Juno fought beside them with her shield raised high, catching strikes meant for the others while driving the edge of it into armored faces and throats before swinging her hammer hard enough to send bodies sprawling across the chamber floor. But the machine never stopped. The 4 outer pillars surrounding it stretched upward through the cathedral ceiling itself, massive black iron structures etched with glowing runes that pulsed brighter every few seconds as crimson light poured down from above. The blood moon hung directly overhead through the circular opening in the roof, and now the group could see it clearly. The pillars were drawing power from it. Streams of red light twisted downward from the sky into the tops of the structures like veins connecting the ritual to the moon itself. Dorian saw it first. "The pillars!" he shouted over the fighting. "Destroy the pillars!" Gabriel turned immediately, following the streams of crimson upward through the chamber. "That's what's feeding the machine!" Jackson didn't hesitate. "Then stop messing around!" They broke outward fast. Dion drove left toward the nearest pillar while Juno pushed right through the Justiciars, trying to intercept them. Dorian sprinted toward another while Gabriel and Jackson moved for the far side of the chamber together, weaving through cultists still chanting on their knees despite the battle raging around them. Flavius finally acknowledged the intruders out loud. "Do not let them break the seals," he roared from above. The Justiciars responded instantly. The entire defense of the chamber shifted toward the pillars. Juno reached the first one and slammed her hammer into the glowing metal with enough force to send sparks bursting across the platform. The pillar shuddered violently, the crimson light running through its runes flickering for half a second before stabilizing again. "I think it's working!" Jackson shouted. Then a Justiciar spear caught her across the ribs hard enough to spin her sideways into the stone. Gabriel turned toward her instinctively and then took a mace strike directly across the shoulder from another guard rushing in through the chaos. The impact nearly dropped him before Dion barreled through the attacker and crushed him into the floor with a single swing. The room kept tightening around them. More guards, more cultists rising now from the chanting with blades drawn beneath their robes. Juno stood and blocked a strike aimed for Dorian, only to take another across her already damaged arm that nearly forced her to one knee. Cassian drove through 3 more Justiciars near the right pillar before one finally managed to catch him across the side with a sword deep enough to spill blood down his coat. He barely reacted. Dorian slammed his gauntlet into the second pillar and cracks splintered through the glowing runes along its surface, but the backlash from the machine hit him immediately afterward like a wave, throwing him backward hard enough to smash him into the stone floor. The machine pulsed again, louder this time. The anti-magic field intensified with it, pressing through the chamber like an invisible weight while the blood moon overhead burned brighter. The group was beginning to lose ground. The fight had collapsed into scattered pockets of violence around the machine, the Justiciars forcing the group apart wherever they could, while the cultists continued chanting around the outer ring in steady, deafening waves. Every few seconds the machine pulsed and the crimson light feeding down from the blood moon surged brighter through the pillars. Dion ignored all of it. He drove straight for the nearest pillar with a roar and swung his hammer two-handed into the black iron hard enough to split the stone beneath it. The impact echoed through the entire room. Cracks exploded across the glowing runes carved into the structure while the crimson stream pouring down from above flickered violently. Again, the second strike shattered part of the pillar outright. The upper section ruptured in a shower of molten metal and fractured stone as the red energy feeding into it burst sideways across the space like lightning. The machine screamed in response, gears grinding unevenly for the first time since the ritual began. "It's weakening!" Dorian shouted from across the room. Dion barely heard him. He was already turning toward the next pillar, charging through the Justiciars trying to intercept him. One guard swung for his head and Dion broke the man's jaw with the backswing without even slowing down. Then they swarmed him. 3 Justiciars hit him all at once from different angles, forcing him backward away from the second pillar before he could strike it cleanly. One spear punched into his side while another drove a shield into his chest, hard enough to stagger him. The third came low with a blade that carved across his thigh. Dion roared and buried his hammer into the first man's shoulder hard enough to collapse the armor inward, but the others stayed on him, dragging him down through sheer weight and numbers. Across the chamber, Gabriel reached the outer ritual circle just as the cultists finally broke formation. They came at him with knives. Red-robed figures surged from the chanting rows with curved ritual daggers in their hands, screaming scripture and insults as they rushed him from every direction. Gabriel dropped the first with a slash across the throat with his own small dagger, but another blade punched into his ribs before he could turn fully. Then another. He staggered backwards as blood spread across his coat. One of the cultists lunged for his throat and Gabriel drove him away with a brutal strike to the face, but the momentum was gone now. The crowd forced him back step by step. knives flashing through the candlelight as the chanting continued around them. Cassian was still tearing through the chamber in a frenzy near Vera's platform, but even he was slowing now. Blood covered him, some his, most not, but every new Justiciar forced him farther from the machine instead of closer. Then, Bishop Glavius raised a hand. His voice thundered across the chamber. "Surrender yourselves." The Justiciars didn't stop fighting, but the chamber shifted around the sound of it. Even the machine itself seemed to pulse slower as Glavius stepped forward along the raised platform above the ritual, staring down at the group with sweat pouring down his face beneath the crimson light. The cultists kept chanting below him. They didn't need him anymore. The verses repeated cyclically. "The unrighteous always resist their judgment," Glavius boomed, his voice carrying unnaturally through the cathedral depths. "Even now, standing beneath the blood moon itself, you still claw against the will of God." Dion shoved one of the Justiciars off of him and tried to rise again. Another slammed him back down. Glavius pointed toward them from above. "You call this evil because you fear what comes after it," he shouted. "You fear reckoning. You fear punishment. You fear the truth that this world has rotted beneath corruption for generations while weak men prayed for salvation that never came." The machine pulsed again beneath Vera's suspended body. The remaining pillars burned brighter. "The Pale King was not the beginning of our suffering," Glavius continued. "He is the answer to it." The chanting rose louder beneath him. "He is divine judgment on the wicked, upon the faithless, upon the diseased world your kind created." Gabriel forced himself upright again, despite the blood running down his side. Jackson stared up at the bishop through the chaos of the chamber, breathing hard now, his weapon still clenched in one hand while the cultists circled closer around them. The Justiciars forced the group tighter together again while he spoke. Dorian was bleeding from the head now. Gabriel could barely stand upright. Dion fought like an animal beneath the weight of the three guards dragging him away from the pillars, and Glavius kept preaching. "The great house has failed," he shouted. "The councils failed. The so-called heroes of this land failed. For centuries, mankind has drowned itself in greed, weakness, corruption, and sin, while pretending the light still protected them." He turned toward the blood moon overhead and raised both hands towards it. "But the crimson sun does not abandon its faithful." The chanting grew louder, faster. "You think Xavier is punishment," Glavius said, his voice almost laughing now. "You think he is catastrophe." His eyes dropped back toward the party. "He is correction." The machine beneath Vera screamed as crimson light surged through the remaining pillars. "He is the fire sent to purge the wicked from this world." The anti-magic field pulsed outward hard enough to shake the entire chamber. "And when he rises," Glavius smiled, "God himself will walk beside him."